Yeah, and it's a really interesting one for classical liberals, the extent to which government should intervene in this situation. Um, for example, John
Hmm.
Stuart Mill's harm principle. We tend to think it's the risk of a situation is on the individual. And if it causes harm to other, that's then when the state intervenes.
Hmm.
But in a situation like a big global health pandemic, when the risk is hard to be on the individual because you might not know if you have it,
Sure.
and you don't know if you spread it, it could be potentially deadly. So the harm principle is a difficult one to measure the extent of government intervention during times like this. But I think maybe if we take a step back and look more broadly at, for example, John Locke's
Hmm.
the idea that government should protect life, liberty, and property, or a state, he says, I believe. Um, so it is the government role to protect life in situations like these. Um, and it's just as much their right to intervene as much as it would be to imprison a murderer, or protect the state against invasion.
Hmm.
So there is definitely a role, but we just have to be very careful about the extent in which they intervene. And once the measures, or once Corona has kind of settled down and there's fewer cases, when these civil liberties can come back. And even in some cases, the classical liberal economics can actually act as quite a good guide for governments on how to control the economy in situations like this.
Hmm.
I'm seeing that in a lot of deregulation happening across the world at the moment. The COVID-19 will kind of spur arguments for nationalism,
Hmm.
nationalist economic policies in countries like the UK, the USA, some countries in Europe. But I'm far more concerned for the nations that are only just becoming more globalized and just implementing policies of free trade. And
Hmm.
like you mentioned, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a great example of that. It's meant to be implemented in July, and upon its introduction, within 5 years, it will cut 90% of tariffs on goods traded between nation states.
That'd be incredible.
Um, yeah, it'd be great news for Africa and a huge economic boost. I think the UN still predicts if every member sign up, it could increase interregional trade by 52% in
Jeez.
just a few years. Um, and it is meant to go into place on July the 1st. And currently 30 members have, oh no, sorry, I think it's 29 members have ratified
Hmm.
the agreement, with 54 signing on. But I don't know for certain, but I do think it's likely the trade agreement would be delayed.
Hmm.
And that's a huge worry, because it being delayed, combined with a lot of countries potentially not being convinced that free trade is a way to go post-crisis, that is a deadly combination. The idea, if you say to someone, yeah, we should grow our own food so we're self-sufficient, we don't rely on anyone else, it sounds plausible in practice,
Sure.
but in reality, it is quite literally nonsense.
Hmm.
If you try to produce everything yourself, you're completely vulnerable to local shocks like a bad harvest or a blight or whatever else. But the chances of a bad harvest happening across the world
Hmm.
are very remote. And national self-sufficiency on anything, whether it be food or manufacturing or services, to me makes about as much sense as a village self-sufficiency or household self-sufficiency. It's basic Ricardian economics, whereby you have comparative advantage. Different people do different jobs better, and that's what helps the economy grow over a long period of time.
Hmm.
And building on that is, if countries do turn inwards and become more nationalist, when this crisis begins to be over and some countries are beginning to recover, so we don't know who it will be first. Maybe it's South Korea, maybe it's Japan,
Right.
and they still have their services, their manufacture, their agriculture businesses up full going, potentially could provide us with tons of services. If we're still being affected by the crisis and we turn our back on that,
Hmm.
that would be hugely damaging. So I think that's something we should watch out for. National self-sufficiency doesn't work, and it does not increase economic productivity.